A waltz ended, and so did a life. Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host, Hartwell. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? Your voices make this journey remarkable. Let's begin. The village hall in St. Mary Mead had been scrubbed until it gleamed, which was saying something, as Mrs. Emmeline Prowse considered scrub brushes to be instruments of salvation. The wooden floor was polished to a treacherous gloss. The bunting was crisp from being ironed, yes, ironed, and the fairy lights, strung with stout farmer's twine and the optimism of the Women's Institute, pretended to be chandeliers. In the rafters a draught coiled and uncoiled itself like a bored cat, but no one admitted to feeling chilly. It was New Year's Eve, and it would not do for anyone to be anything but festive. Miss Jane Marple, a small, upright figure in soft grey with a spray of dried lavender pinned at her shoulder, sat half a degree removed from the bustle, where she could watch without being in the way. She had been escorted in by Mr. Raymond West, her nephew, down for the holiday, and promptly abandoned to a chair near the fern stand when Mr. West was claimed by Mrs. Bantry for a polka he did not at all intend to dance. Across the hall, Mrs. Prowse, square and formidable in plum satin that made statements about both character and budget, hovered near the punch bowl. "Only the second cup, Mr. Copley," she said to the village postmaster, who had been smiling too brightly for the last hour. "After the business with the raffle I have decided upon vigilance." "Why, Mrs. Prowse," returned Mr. Copley, eyelashes fluttering, "I am as sober as the vicar's sermon." "The vicar's sermon on the harvest festival," Mrs. Prowse corrected. "On Whitsun you have been known to nod." "Only out of reverence," Mr. Copley said, and moved away with his second cup, modestly refilled. On the small stage at the end of the hall, 3 young men in borrowed tuxedos were rendering waltzes with earnestness and occasional accuracy. The violinist had put a sprig of mistletoe in his lapel and looked as though he hoped music might be improved by botany. Couples drifted into motion. The dance cards printed with the village crest, a somewhat belligerent sheep, flapped like small banners in the ladies' hands. "Will you not join them, Miss Marple?" asked Dr. Leonard Reeves, freshly appointed to take over old Dr. Haydock's rounds in January, and wearing his optimism as neatly as his white pocket square. "My dear young man," said Miss Marple, "my waltzing days were never numerous and are now purely historical. But I do like to see other people enjoy themselves. It is so instructive." "Instructive?" Dr. Reeves smiled. "One sees things," Miss Marple said mildly. And indeed she did. She saw Mrs. Prowse's plum satin catch at the cloakroom door on a little splinter that had eluded even her zeal. She noted how Mrs. Prowse turned her head quickly to make sure no one had observed the tug. She saw that Mrs. Augusta Vale, Vivian to those who admired her posters at the new dance studio in Much Benham, wore a red dress that a cautious person might have considered a negotiation with calamity. She saw that Colonel Oswald Archer, who had retired from a life of being important and now lived in the White House with the clipped U, kept his back very straight when Mrs. Vale laughed at something the Colonel had not said. She saw the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chaffee, glance at the clock every 9 minutes with a face set toward midnight, like a pilgrim toward a shrine, and she noticed that Mr. Copley, on his second cup of punch, greeted Mrs. Vale with a salute too jaunty for a man whose hat was resting safely in the cloakroom. But most of all, she watched the young woman by the window, Lucy Barton, the schoolmistress, newly come from the north, with a face too open for village life, and gloves darned by a hand that was proud of its skill. Lucy danced with no one, but smiled as though she didn't mind. That sort of smile was a thing Miss Marple understood very well. At 1:15 midnight, Mr. Raymond West, having escaped another polka, fetched his aunt a glass of lemonade and, in the turn of his head toward the stage, failed to see Miss Marple's attention fix for a second, sharp and sudden, on the punch bowl. A gentleman with a narrow face and a suit, a fraction better than his means, had leaned over it. as though consulting the floating orange slices about a difficult decision. His name was Mr. Edwin Lake, and he had come to St. Mary Mead 6 months before to manage the building society. He had come alone. He had looked over people's accounts with the holy gravity of a priest at confession. He did not, as a rule, linger over punch. He dipped the ladle, then paused, considering. Miss Marple watched him put the ladle down without pouring. She also watched Mrs. Prowse's eyes on him, and the little fold of skin that appeared where her mouth decided upon a tighter line. "Do you suppose," Miss Marple asked idly, "that Mr. Lake dances?" Her nephew laughed. "He looks like he audits waltzes to make sure they add up." The band, having arrived triumphantly at the end of something Viennese, were begged by Mrs. Bantry, who liked a spectacle, to play the Blue Danube for the last waltz of the old year. "And then," she declared, "we shall push the old thing off the clock and embrace the new. Metaphorically speaking, of course." The last waltz unfurled. Colonel Archer claimed Mrs. Vale. Lucy Barton, to her own surprise, found herself led onto the floor by Dr. Reeves. Mr. Copley attempted a turn with Mrs. Chaffee, and was guided back to rhythm with affectionate severity. Miss Marple folded her hands. She had always thought that last dances were like last words. People told you what mattered to them if you let them. They could not help it. When the clock over the door yawned toward 2 minutes to midnight, the fairy lights flickered with the restlessness of their borrowed extensions. Someone, no one later quite knew who, began to count 10 to 9. And Auld Lang Syne rose ready on the room's collective breath. The lights went out. It was not a dramatic extinguishing like a theatre curtain dropping. It was worse, a series of little failures, each string of fairy lights giving up at its own uncertain pace, until the hall was left with only the pale winter moon pressing its face to the high windows. A brief, delighted squeal came from a corner, where young people still believed darkness to be a thrilling cousin of mischief. Someone laughed. Someone else said, "Oh, not again, the fuses." Mrs. Prowse's voice, brisk, offended by what it could not control, said, "Mr. Copley, the spare candles." 5, 4, intoned someone, stubbornly continuing the count. In the dark, people shifted. The last bars of the waltz faltered, became an embarrassed sniffle from the trumpet. There was the muffled thump of someone stumbling against a chair, and the whisper scrape of the cloakroom door opening and closing. Quietly, almost well-bred. 3, 2, 1. A cheer that lacked confidence rose and broke like a wave against a stone. There was a kiss, then another. Miss Marple could tell by the particular little startled breath a kissed person made. Someone said, "Happy New—" in a tone that contained both happiness and the sudden absence of it. The lights returned all at once with an unromantic pop, flooding the hall with an honesty that suited no one. Faces blinked. Hands untangled. Mr. Copley's tie had become an argument with his collar. Mrs. Vale's lipstick had earned a small legend. Lucy Barton stood alone, her cheeks very pink and her eyes very bright, as if the lights had caught her out at something she had not done. Beside the cloakroom door, the sprig of bunting that had caught Mrs. Prowse's dress now hung torn. Miss Marple's eyes went to it, in the same breath that they followed Mrs. Prowse's progress toward the punch bowl, which she approached as a general might a compromised fort. "Oh, good," said Mrs. Bantry with relief. "Here we are again." Then, from the cloakroom, a sound, small, strangled, and final. Not a scream exactly, but the thing that comes just before one. The door opened. Mr. Edwin Lake stood there, very pale, his hand on the jamb as though he required the wood to finish the simple act of standing. Behind him, a hat tumbled from a low hook and rolled to a stop like a coin running out of hope. "Mrs. Prowse," Mr. Lake said, as if the name were the only firm thing in a world that had tilted. Mrs. Prowse's he did not finish. He did not need to. The little crowd that forms in any emergency gathered as if by instinct, breaking into the neat lines of the dance and reforming around the dark mouth of the cloakroom. Miss Marple, who would not have pushed anyone for any reason, found that she was suddenly very near the front, simply because others had stepped back. Mrs. Emmeline Prowse lay on the floor between the benches and the coat rack, as tidy in death as she had, no doubt, intended to be in life. One hand was still half extended toward the hook where her shawl had been. The other lay on her bodice, plum satin puckered beneath it. Her face was surprisingly calm. Only the angle of her head, tilted like a clock that had been taken down and set incorrectly, spoiled the serenity. "Oh," breathed Mrs. Chaffee in a kind of prayer. "Oh, no." Dr. Reeves knelt, all professionalism now, his fingers quick and searching at the wrist then the throat. He looked up at the faces peering in. His optimism was not on his face now. Something older and sterner had come to sit behind his eyes. "I'm afraid," he said, "Mrs. Prowse is dead." There was the rattle of someone's dance card falling. Miss Marple heard Mr. Copley say in a high, bright voice not at all like his own, "But it's New Year's," as though the year itself might take offense at such discourtesy as a death at its very threshold. In the perfumed, breath-warm air of the cloakroom hung a smell that had not been there before. Not scent, not polish. Miss Marple, whose nose recognized as much as her eyes, tucked that away with a small inward nod. "Should we fetch the constable?" Mr. West asked, already turning. "Yes, yes," said many voices. "Fetch Inspector Slack, fetch gently," Miss Marple said. She had not raised her voice, but it reached past the panic in the way a lullaby reaches a child who believes in monsters. "Dr. Reeves will see to what must be done immediately. There is no need for everyone to crowd. If Mrs. Chaffee would be so kind as to bring water, and Mrs. Bantry to make sure the door remains open for air. Mr. Lake," she added with a look at the pale man in the doorway, "perhaps you might sit for a moment." Mr. Lake stared at her as though she were a figure encountered in a dream, irrelevant and yet somehow essential. "Yes," he said. He sat mechanically on the bench. His gaze went not to Mrs. Prowse but to the far wall, where someone had tacked the dance studio's poster. The final dance of New Year's night, a demonstration by Mrs. Augusta Vale, January 3rd. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the poster, then more thoughtfully on the tiny thread caught on the cloakroom latch, a thread the exact color of plum satin. There was another thread, too, barely there, glinting like a whisper. Not satin, something coarser, garden twine perhaps, or the sort of cord one uses when parcels must look respectable. She did not crouch, did not touch. There would be time for all that, and others who liked to do such things with much fussing. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the people arranged around the doorway like figures in a tableau, the vicar's wife with her hands clasped, Colonel Archer set rigidly to attention, Mrs. Vale with her mouth a half-moon of stylized horror, Mr. Copley pressing his own lips together as if to keep a secret from falling out, and Lucy Barton, the schoolmistress, standing very straight, clutching her gloves, her eyes not on the body but on Mr. Lake's pale face. There were a great many ways to die, Miss Marple knew. There were fewer ways to kill, but there were a great many ways to be found out. "Raymond," she said quietly, not taking her eyes from the room, "do be a dear and ask someone to ring the police." And as the music stands on the stage, trembled slightly from the draught at the rafters, and as somewhere beyond the hall, the first weak fireworks of the new year crackled without conviction, Miss Marple folded her small hands more tightly in her lap and began, very calmly, to think. The village hall, which moments before had been full of laughter and music, now stood cloaked in that uneasy stillness that follows the arrival of death. The lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a cold brilliance that exaggerated every crease, every twitch of unease on the faces gathered around Mrs. Prowse's body. Somewhere a violin gave a single accidental note as the young musician's trembling hand brushed the string. No one moved to silence it. Dr. Reeves was the first to recover a semblance of composure. Rising from his knees, he took a deep breath and pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his hands as though the act itself might restore order. "She's gone," he repeated unnecessarily. "It must have happened very quickly. There's some discoloration at the lips. It could be poison." A murmur ran through the small crowd, low and incredulous, like the wind before a storm. Poison. The word was indecent somehow. In the warmth of the village hall with its bunting and half-empty punch bowl, Miss Marple's eyes moved gently from face to face. No one wanted to meet them. Mrs. Bantry's hand fluttered near her throat, where a string of pearls seemed suddenly too tight. Poison? But how dreadful! Surely not here, not at our New Year's dance. People have been poisoned in worse places, Miss Marple said softly, though rarely at such an inconvenient hour. The remark, mild as it was, made several heads turn toward her. Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly serene, her voice the same calm murmur she might have used to discuss the weather. "We must, of course, wait for Inspector Slack," she added, "but while we do, it would be prudent to keep things just as they are." "Yes, yes," Dr. Reeves agreed quickly. No one should leave. That declaration sent another ripple through the room. Colonel Archer straightened, his jaw tightening. "Surely you don't mean to hold us here like criminals, Doctor?" "Merely as witnesses," Miss Marple interjected. "A most respectable condition, Colonel." The colonel subsided with a harumph, but his color rose. Mrs. Vale, crimson dress glinting under the harsh lights, gave a delicate shiver and pressed a hand to her temple. "I can't bear this," she murmured. Poor Mrs. Prowse. Why, I was speaking to her not an hour ago. She was full of talk about the raffle and her resolutions for the new year. And now, her voice trailed off into a faint sigh. Lucy Barton stepped forward instinctively, guiding the dance instructor to a chair. Miss Marple watched that small act with quiet interest. Miss Barton's hands were steady, but her eyes avoided the body. Not fear, more like calculation. Miss Marple had seen that look before in her gardening club, when someone had realized the prize roses might have been switched. The constable arrived 15 minutes later, red-faced and apologetic, followed soon after by Inspector Slack, broad brisk, and already exuding the air of a man whose evening had been most unfairly interrupted. He gave the room a single sweeping look, his gaze settling on Miss Marple with faint resignation. "Evening, Miss Marple. I might have known you'd be about." "New Year's Eve, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Even the most unlikely people are about." Slack grunted, then crouched beside the body while Dr. Reeves briefed him in low tones. The inspector's eyes narrowed as he examined the faint bluish tint at the corners of Mrs. Prowse's mouth. "Poison, you say? Nasty business. And in punch, by the look of it. Who's had some?" "Everyone, I should think," Mrs. Bantry said faintly. "Except Miss Marple, who prefers lemonade." Slack's head turned toward the elderly lady. "That right, ma'am?" "Oh, quite," she said, "though I did notice that Mrs. Prowse was rather particular about who poured the punch." Slack's pencil hesitated. "Particular how?" "She insisted upon serving it herself," Miss Marple replied. "Said it was her duty as hostess to see it properly done. But I observed that Mr. Edwin Lake poured himself a cup just before midnight, when Mrs. Prowse was elsewhere. He didn't drink it, however." All eyes turned toward Mr. Lake, who looked as though the walls had begun closing in. I was only going to refresh it," he stammered. "The bowl was nearly empty. Then I saw her coming back and I thought better of it." "Very considerate," said Slack dryly. "You didn't drink any of it, you say?" "No, I set the cup down." His voice was faint. "I don't even remember where." Miss Marple's eyes, mild and unreadable, followed a small movement near the table where the punch bowl gleamed beneath the lights. Lucy Barton was quietly removing a single cup from beside it, placing it apart from the rest. "That might be the one," she said softly. "Don't touch anything," barked Slack, making her jump. He fetched the cup himself, holding it up to the light. There was a faint rim of lipstick, plum-colored like Mrs. Prowse's gown. He gave a grim nod. "We'll have this tested. Until then, no one leaves the hall." The group settled uneasily into small clusters, murmuring behind hands, casting glances at one another. Gossip began to coil and twist, feeding on speculation. Mrs. Chaffee whispered that Mrs. Prowse had argued with Mr. Copley over the raffle proceeds. Mrs. Bantry was certain it had something to do with jealousy, Mrs. Vale's red dress and the Colonel's gallantry being frequent topics of her imagination. Miss Marple listened without appearing to listen. She saw how Mr. Copley's hands shook as he fumbled with his spectacles, how Colonel Archer stood ramrod straight but watched Mrs. Vale too closely, and how Mr. Lake stared not at the body, but at the poster still tacked to the wall, the final dance of New Year's night. When Slack moved off to telephone for reinforcements, Miss Marple rose quietly and approached Dr. Reeves. "You said there was discoloration," she murmured. "Did you happen to notice the smell?" He blinked. "Smell? I can't say that I did. Why?" "There was a faint odor. Bitter almonds, I thought." "One learns these things from crime novels, of course." Her eyes twinkled. "Cyanide?" His expression tightened. But where would she have come by such a thing? "That," said Miss Marple, "is a question worth asking. But it may be even more important to ask who else might have known she had it." Before he could answer, a sudden cry came from the stage. One of the young musicians had lifted a violin case from behind the curtain and found tucked beneath it an envelope. Slack took it at once, examining the bold, slanted handwriting. "To be opened at midnight." He tore it open and read aloud. "Let the new year begin without hypocrisy. Some debts must be paid." A hush fell. Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly. Mr. Copley mopped his brow. "Why, that's a threat," he whispered. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it carried. "No, Mr. Copley, it's a confession or a warning." "Perhaps both." And as the wind pressed faintly at the windows, carrying with it the muffled echoes of fireworks from the village green, Miss Marple folded her hands once more. The night had only just begun to tell its story, and she, quietly attentive as ever, intended to hear every word of it. Inspector Slack held the envelope, as if it might reveal another secret by the warmth of his grip alone. The murmur that followed his reading had the low, dangerous sound of a kettle about to boil. Miss Marple watched the crowd's reaction, as carefully as she might watch the behavior of birds before rain. Each flutter, each nervous glance a clue in itself. It was not the message alone that unsettled them, but what it implied, that Mrs. Prowse had not merely died but been chosen. "Debts," murmured Mrs. Bantry, her voice wavering. Who could owe debts to Emmeline Prowse? She was a dreadful woman for keeping her accounts straight. "Straight," repeated Mr. Copley under his breath, "and never forgiving either." He seemed to regret the words at once, glancing quickly at Miss Marple, whose expression was one of mild attentiveness, as though she hadn't heard. Slack cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "All right, listen here. Nobody moves, nobody leaves. I'll have questions for each of you. Mrs. Prowse's death may have been poison, and this note," he tapped it with his finger, "suggests it wasn't an accident." He gestured toward the band, who were huddled like schoolboys after a prank. "You lot. Anyone see who left this envelope behind the curtain?" The violinist, a lanky youth with a pale forehead, swallowed. "No, sir. We went out for a breath of air before the last waltz. It was crowded back here, coats and all that. When the lights went out, we thought it was a fuse, not, well, this." Slack nodded curtly, jotting it down. "So it could have been placed there any time between the dance beginning and midnight." Miss Marple, who had been studying the poster above the stage, spoke quietly. "Or perhaps even earlier. The note was addressed to the moment, not the event. Midnight, after all, has a certain symmetry. It invites confession." Slack gave her a sideways glance. "You mean whoever wrote this expected something to happen right then?" "Or intended that it should," Miss Marple said. "Though perhaps not quite as it did." Dr. Reeves, standing by the punch bowl, frowned. "But if it was poison, then surely whoever poured the cup knew when she would drink it." "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured, "which means they either served her themselves or relied upon her habits being predictable. And Mrs. Prowse," she added with a faint smile, "was nothing if not a creature of habit. The group seemed to draw a collective breath at that. Mrs. Chaffee, the vicar's wife, wrung her hands. She always did take the first cup of anything, didn't she? She said it showed confidence in her guests. A commendable gesture, Miss Marple said softly, though tonight rather fatal. There was a stir by the cloakroom door. Lucy Barton, who had been silent until now, spoke hesitantly. Inspector, if the poison was in the punch, then anyone who drank from it could have been harmed. Why Mrs. Prowse alone? Good question, miss, said Slack approvingly. Either she took the cup that had been meant for someone else, or the poison was only in her glass. He turned his hard gaze on Mr. Lake. You poured yourself one just before midnight, didn't you? Mr. Lake's hands clenched on his knees. Yes, but I didn't drink it. I told you that. Did you see where you put it? No, it might have been, well, anywhere. His voice broke a little. Good heavens, are you suggesting I meant to kill her? Slack gave a thin smile. I'm not suggesting anything yet. But it's a curious coincidence, isn't it? You pour yourself a drink, she dies from one, and there's a threatening note at the same time. Miss Marple interjected gently. Coincidences are rarely curious, Inspector. They're usually very human. Mr. Lake may have poured himself a drink for reasons quite innocent, and Mrs. Prowse might have helped herself to it later. She was a woman who liked to take charge, after all. The inspector grunted, unconvinced. Maybe. But I'll still want your fingerprints, Mr. Lake. Lucy Barton shot a quick, almost protective glance at the young man, then turned away before anyone noticed. Almost anyone. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, thoughtful. In the corner, Mrs. Vale was weeping into a lace handkerchief that had clearly been waiting for such a dramatic purpose. Poor Emmeline, she sniffed. So respectable, so unlovable. Though I suppose one mustn't speak ill of the dead. No, said Colonel Archer. His tone clipped. One mustn't. Miss Marple caught the faint flicker of disdain in his eyes. There was something guarded about the Colonel's manner, as though he stood to attention not from habit, but to conceal unease. His eyes darted toward Mrs. Vale, then away again. Slack resumed his questioning methodically, one by one. When he reached Colonel Archer, he asked, You knew Mrs. Prowse well, sir? Well enough, the Colonel said stiffly. She was on the parish council. We had dealings over the matter of the war memorial repairs. She was determined. Meaning difficult, muttered Slack. The Colonel gave no reply. And you, Mrs. Vale? Slack asked, turning to her. Did you know her outside of village business? Mrs. Vale fluttered. Only socially. I run the dance studio in Much Benham, and she came to see about lessons once. Said it was indecent for a woman of her age to waltz. I believe she was referring to me. A ripple of uneasy laughter escaped the crowd, quickly stifled. Miss Marple noted that Lucy Barton didn't laugh at all. When Slack finished, he gestured for the constable to escort the body to the vestry until the coroner arrived. As the group began to disperse under his orders, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting bag untouched beside her. The inspector approached her with a sigh. You'll say I'm going about it wrong again, I suppose. Not at all, she said pleasantly. You're being very thorough. Though I wonder if the note and the poison are quite as connected as they appear. Slack frowned. You think they're separate? I think, Miss Marple said, folding her hands, that Mrs. Prowse had a remarkable gift for making enemies. And when one has too many enemies, the difficulty is not discovering who wished one dead, but who acted upon it. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the moonlight glinted on the frost outside. Besides, she added softly, there are debts of many kinds, Inspector, some measured in pounds and shillings, and some in guilt. Slack opened his mouth to question her further, but at that moment a sudden commotion rose near the doorway. The constable had returned, pale and breathless. Inspector! There's something in her handbag. Found it by the coat rack. He held up a small silver flask. Smells of almonds. The inspector's brows shot up. So she had it with her, did she? Then she might have, but Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. Mrs. Prowse may have held the bottle, but she did not pour her own death. Someone gave her that flask, or knew she had it, and used it most cleverly. You see, poison is not only a substance, it is an intention. And intentions, she said, looking once more at the uneasy faces of the villagers, are very difficult to conceal. Outside, a church bell began to chime 1 o'clock. The new year had truly begun, and in St. Mary Mead it had arrived carrying secrets in its wake. Inspector Slack took the silver flask from the constable's trembling hand, holding it up to the light. Its polished surface gleamed dully beneath the hall lamps, distorted reflections of worried faces flickering across it. "So this," he said slowly, "was found in Mrs. Prowse's handbag." "Yes, sir," the constable replied, his voice uncertain. "I thought it best not to open it." Slack gave a short nod. "Quite right. We'll have the lab test it, but I'd wager a week's pay it's cyanide." "Smells of almonds, you said?" "Yes, sir." The inspector lifted it cautiously toward his nose and drew a shallow breath. His expression darkened. "Right again." "Bitter almonds, classic. Someone meant business." A shudder passed through the gathered villagers. Miss Marple's calm eyes lingered on the flask, then drifted thoughtfully toward the cloakroom, where Mrs. Prowse's coat still hung neatly on its peg, a dark silhouette against the wall. "She was very particular about her possessions," Miss Marple murmured. "I doubt she would have brought a flask of any sort to a public dance. She disapproved of spirits except for medicinal tinctures, as she called them. Then what was it doing in her bag?" Slack asked sharply. "Perhaps someone put it there," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps she was given it, believing it to be something else entirely." The inspector frowned. "You mean a trick?" "People are very easily deceived when they wish to believe," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but sure. "Especially those who pride themselves on their discernment." Slack's pencil hovered above his notebook. "You think someone handed it to her tonight?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the refreshment table. "Perhaps before midnight, perhaps earlier. A gift, a token of appreciation, even a small joke. Mrs. Prowse was fond of appearing generous herself. She might have accepted something she thought a gesture of goodwill." There was a low murmur near the punch bowl. Lucy Barton had stepped forward again, her expression troubled. "Inspector, Mrs. Prowse was collecting raffle prizes earlier in the evening. She had a basket with her, small items people donated, soap, chocolates, even a bottle or two. Perhaps this flask was part of that." Slack's eyes narrowed. "And where's that basket now?" Lucy hesitated. "I'm not sure. I last saw it behind the stage, near the musicians." "Fetch it," he ordered. The constable trotted off. Silence filled the gap he left, heavy and expectant. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "A raffle prize," she repeated softly. "How interesting. You know, people often give away the things they no longer want, but occasionally they give away something they very much wish to be rid of." Mrs. Bantry gasped faintly. "Jane, you mean someone might have slipped poison into the prize basket on purpose?" Miss Marple's smile was small and sad. "It would not be the first time a charitable act was used to disguise malice, dear," the constable returned, holding a wicker basket lined with checked cloth. Inside were several modest prizes: a bar of lavender soap, a tin of biscuits, a small packet of handkerchiefs, and a narrow space where something else had clearly been. "There's a gap," Miss Marple said quietly. "Something about the size of a flask, wouldn't you say?" Slack nodded grimly. "Right, that settles that. Someone put it in the basket knowing Mrs. Prowse would handle it, and perhaps even open it." He turned toward the crowd. "Now then, who donated this basket? Anyone here?" "I did," came a hesitant voice. Mr. Copley stepped forward, mopping his brow. "Well, not the whole basket, you understand. I only contributed the biscuits. Mrs. Prowse asked me to help collect things. She said it was for the New Year Goodwill Fund." "Who else contributed?" A chorus of names followed. Mrs. Chaffee, Mrs. Vale, even Colonel Archer. Each offered small, harmless items. No one claimed the flask. Slack's eyes hardened. So it just appeared in the basket, did it? No one knows where it came from? Miss Marple's voice floated softly through the tension. Perhaps we should ask instead who saw Mrs. Prowse handle it. That would tell us more than who placed it there. Lucy Barton spoke again slowly. I did, I think. Near the end of the evening, she was sorting through the prizes, muttering about having to redo the labels. I remember she picked up something silver and said it was a man's sort of thing, not proper for a raffle. So I didn't see what she did with it after that. All eyes turned to her. Miss Marple studied the girl's face with quiet interest. Lucy's composure was admirable, but her fingers fidgeted at her sleeves. A man sort of thing, Miss Marple repeated. How curious. Her tone was light, but the phrase seemed to strike her with private significance. Before anyone could speak again, a sharp sound broke the silence, the creak of the hall door. A cold draught swept through as the vicar himself entered, still in his overcoat, his expression grave. I came as soon as I heard, he said. A terrible thing, simply terrible. Poor Mrs. Prowse. He looked at the gathered villagers, then at Inspector Slack. Is there anything I can do? Slack shook his head. Just stay put for now, Reverend. We're sorting out who handled what. The vicar's gaze moved briefly to Miss Marple. You're helping again, I see, he said gently. Oh, I only observe, she replied. But sometimes observation tells more than examination. The vicar nodded faintly, as though he understood. Slack moved toward the table where the punch bowl still gleamed under the lights. We'll have the rest of this tested too, he said, signaling the constable to cover it. If the poison wasn't in the flask, it might have been here. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Inspector, may I make a small suggestion? He sighed. You usually do. Perhaps you might ask everyone where they were when the lights went out. It's often in the dark that people do their most revealing things. You see, she added quietly, it's very convenient to pour something into a glass when no one can see. Slack looked at her for a long moment, then nodded grudgingly. All right. One by one, then. We'll start with you, Mr. Lake. Mr. Lake swallowed. I was near the cloakroom door, I think. Just coming back from the punch table. And Mrs. Prowse? She was just there, too. I heard her say something about the clock. Then the lights went out, and after that, I don't know. I couldn't see. I felt someone brush past me. Then the music stopped. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Brush past you, Mr. Lake? How interesting. Was it perhaps a woman's perfume you noticed? He blinked. I think so. Yes, something strong, sweet. Mrs. Vale's lips parted, but she said nothing. Slack caught the exchange and scribbled in his notebook. All right. That's something. Miss Marple sank back into her chair, eyes thoughtful. Perfume, she murmured almost to herself, and bitter almonds. 2 scents that do not mix well. The hall had grown quiet again, save for the faint ticking of the clock above the stage. Outside, frost whispered along the windows. The villagers stood in uneasy silence, each retreating into their own thoughts, their own fears. Miss Marple, ever composed, folded her hands. She could feel it now. The threads tightening, small lies beginning to fray. Somewhere among these familiar faces was a person who had poured death into a glass, confident that no one would notice. But she had noticed. And before the night was through, she meant to know exactly who had danced with murder at the stroke of midnight. The questioning went on well past 1 o'clock, until the once bright village hall looked more like a stage set abandoned after a performance. The fairy lights were dimmed now, the bunting hung limp, and the music stands on the platform stood like mourners at a funeral. People shifted uneasily in their chairs, while Inspector Slack took notes with the air of a man chiseling each syllable into stone. Miss Marple, sitting serenely near the ferns, seemed as patient as a cat at a mouse-hole. She never interrupted, but her eyes missed nothing. By the time Slack turned to Mrs. Vale, the tension in the air could have been bottled. "And where were you, madam, when the lights went out?" he asked, tone-clipped. Mrs. Vale dabbed her eyes delicately with her lace handkerchief. "Why, I was dancing, of course. With Colonel Archer. We were near the window, I think. It was so sudden, the darkness, I mean. I let out a little scream, I'm afraid. Colonel Archer cleared his throat. Perfectly natural, Inspector. My partner was startled, as anyone would be. I assured her there was no danger, Slack grunted. And after the lights came back? Mrs. Vale hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the cloakroom. I saw people moving, confusion everywhere. Then that dreadful cry and poor Mr. Lake by the door. I went nowhere near the punch table, I assure you. Miss Marple's expression was one of mild sympathy. No doubt, my dear, she said softly. Though one does wonder how your perfume came to be noticed quite so strongly near the cloakroom. The woman stiffened, a faint flush rising beneath her rouge. My perfume. I suppose it does linger. One can't help that. Of course not, Miss Marple agreed. Only it is rather distinct. Jasmine and something sharper, perhaps. I imagine it could easily mask another scent entirely. Mrs. Vale's lips parted, but she found no answer. Colonel Archer intervened quickly. Really, Miss Marple, are we to make a mystery out of scent now? Miss Marple smiled. Scent, Colonel, has solved more mysteries than one might think. People carry their secrets with them, quite literally in the air they leave behind. Inspector Slack gave her a look of cautious respect. I suppose you've seen that before. Oh yes, she said. Once in Torquay and another time in Chipping Cleghorn. Perfume can be quite incriminating when it lingers longer than good manners. The corner of Slack's mouth twitched. Well, I'll keep that in mind. He turned his attention back to the list of names. Mrs. Chaffee, your turn. Where were you when the lights went out? The vicar's wife folded her hands nervously. I was near the bandstand helping one of the young men fetch his bow. He'd dropped it. And then everything went dark. I didn't move until the lights came on again, I promise. Did you notice anyone moving near the punch table? She hesitated. I thought I saw someone there. A man, I think. But it was so dark, perhaps I imagined it. Try to remember, Slack urged. Tall, short, anything at all. Mrs. Chaffee closed her eyes briefly. Not tall. About Mr. Lake's height, perhaps. But I can't be certain. Mr. Lake stiffened, and Slack's gaze flicked toward him. You seem to be everywhere tonight, Mr. Lake. I didn't do anything. He protested, voice cracking. You're all acting as though Miss Marple spoke before he could finish. No one is accusing you, Mr. Lake, not yet. But perhaps you might help us with something else. Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. Earlier, you said you didn't drink your cup of punch. Do you recall what made you change your mind? He blinked. What made me? Well, Mrs. Prowse came over, and she said she'd rather pour for me. She took the ladle right out of my hand and said, Men shouldn't meddle in domestic things. I set my glass down and went to fetch my coat. That's all. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. So she may have taken your cup by mistake. Slack nodded grimly. And if that was the poisoned one, then perhaps the intended victim was Mr. Lake, not Mrs. Prowse. Miss Marple finished quietly. The words seemed to echo through the hall. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Lucy Barton turned pale. Even Colonel Archer's stiff bearing faltered for a moment. Intended me, Mr. Lake stammered. But why on earth? Who would want to harm me? That, Mr. Lake, Miss Marple said softly, is exactly what we must find out. The inspector scribbled furiously, but Miss Marple was no longer watching him. Her gaze had turned inward, piecing together the small fragments, the flask, the raffle basket, the perfume, the misplaced cup. The pattern was forming, though faintly still, like embroidery traced in chalk before the first stitch. A sharp knock on the door startled everyone. A young constable entered, his boots slick with frost. Beg pardon, sir. We've just searched the cloakroom more thoroughly. Found something else behind the coat rack. Slack took the object from him, a small envelope slightly crumpled, its edges damp from the floor. On the front, in that same bold slanted handwriting, were the words, One debt settled, one yet unpaid. A murmur swept the room. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. How curious, she murmured. So there was more than one message. Slack tore it open. Inside was a folded dance card. the same sort given to all the ladies at the ball, but this one bore only 2 names written in ink. Mr. Lake and Mrs. Vale. The inspector's gaze shot toward the crimson-dressed woman. Care to explain this, madam? Her face went pale, then flushed again. I don't know how that got there. I never wrote such a thing. Miss Marple's voice came quiet but firm. Perhaps not. But someone did, and someone meant us to find it. You see, Inspector, our murderer is clever. Clever enough to disguise guilt beneath confusion, but not clever enough to stop weaving their own snare. The inspector frowned. Meaning? Meaning, Miss Marple said, rising with the slow grace of certainty, that whoever planned this meant for us to suspect the wrong person. They wanted to obscure the truth behind jealousy and gossip. But the true motive lies not in romance, Inspector. It lies in retribution. Mrs. Prowse was never the intended victim. She simply stood in the wrong place with the wrong cup at the wrong moment. Slack's pencil froze. And who was the right one, then? Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the assembled faces. The trembling schoolmistress, the rigid colonel, the pale young banker, and the weeping dance instructor. Her gaze came to rest at last on Lucy Barton, whose gloved hands gripped each other so tightly that her knuckles showed white. "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "Yes, I see it now," but she said nothing more, not yet. It was not her way to declare the answer before the story itself was ready. For in matters of murder, she knew well, the truth was like tea. It needed time to steep before it revealed its strength. Inspector Slack tucked the second note carefully into an evidence envelope, his brow furrowed deep in thought. The hall had grown almost oppressively still. Only the occasional creak of the floorboards broke the silence, each sound magnified by tension. The villagers, restless and fearful, exchanged whispers like dry leaves stirring before a storm. Miss Marple, seated primly on her chair near the ferns, looked perfectly at home amid the unease. She might have been attending a church social, rather than sitting among potential murderers. Slack's voice, when it came, was tight. "This changes things. Someone's playing a game, leaving notes, stirring suspicion, trying to make fools of us all." He glanced sharply toward Mrs. Vale. "You're sure you didn't write this dance card?" She shook her head vehemently, the diamond on her wrist trembling with the movement. "Of course I didn't. Why would I write my own name next to Mr. Lake's? People might talk. And they already do, far too much." "That they do," muttered Colonel Archer under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Slack caught it. "Meaning what, Colonel?" The man straightened stiffly. "Meaning only that this village thrives on gossip, Inspector. You'll get more speculation than fact if you listen to every whisper." Miss Marple's gentle voice slid between them like a thread through cloth. "True enough, Colonel. But gossip, like dandelion seeds, always grows from something. One just has to trace the wind back to where it started." Colonel Archer turned a hard gaze toward her, but she only smiled pleasantly. Slack sighed. "All right, we'll sort the talk from the truth later. For now, nobody touches these notes and nobody leaves until we're done. Miss Barton, since you were near Mrs. Prowse for much of the evening, did you notice her drinking anything besides the punch?" Lucy Barton looked startled to hear her name spoken so suddenly. Her eyes, wide and pale in the harsh light, darted toward the cloakroom and back again. "No, Inspector. She only had the 1 cup. She was cross with me at the time. Said I'd miscounted the raffle tickets. After that, I didn't go near her." Slack scribbled, watching her. "You seem nervous, Miss Barton." "Well, of course I'm nervous," she cried, her voice breaking slightly. "A woman's been murdered, and you're all staring at each other like wolves." Her outburst drew a few murmurs of sympathy. Miss Marple regarded her quietly, hands folded, her gaze soft but penetrating. "Quite understandable, my dear," she said kindly. "Though, if I may, it's not only fear I hear in your voice. There's something else, perhaps sorrow." Lucy's mouth opened, then closed again. She turned away, blinking rapidly. Colonel Archer cleared his throat in the awkward pause that followed. "Really, Miss Marple, must we drag emotions into this? The young lady is distressed. Naturally so. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Of course, Colonel. Yet emotions are rather like fingerprints. They tend to leave impressions where one least expects them. The inspector frowned at her cryptic remark, but Miss Marple was already looking at the Colonel, her eyes twinkling faintly. You were very gallant this evening, Colonel. I'm sure Mrs. Vale appreciated your attentions. He stiffened. I hardly think that's relevant. Oh, but it may be, she said mildly. You see, gallantry can sometimes be mistaken for devotion, and devotion, when misunderstood, can lead to quite dramatic outcomes. Mrs. Vale's painted lips parted in offence. Are you implying that I encouraged— Not at all, my dear, Miss Marple said soothingly. Only that misunderstandings are such fertile ground for tragedy. Slack rubbed his temples. You're suggesting jealousy again, Miss Marple? I'm suggesting human nature, Inspector, she said. It rarely stays quiet for long. He gave a humorless chuckle. You'll forgive me if I prefer motives I can write down on paper. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, but people rarely commit murder for reasons tidy enough to fit in a notebook. The constable re-entered then, carrying a small bundle. Found this, sir. In the corridor behind the stage. Slack unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a small glass vial, empty but smelling strongly of almonds. The label was half torn, the remaining letters reading Edie Compound. Cyanide, Slack muttered grimly. And empty. A gasp rippled through the hall. Lucy Barton turned away, covering her mouth. Mrs. Bantry clutched her pearls as if they might protect her from the word itself. Who found it? Slack demanded. I did, sir, said the constable, hidden behind a broom. Wrapped in this bit of curtain fabric. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Curtain fabric, you say? From the stage curtains, perhaps? The constable nodded. Then whoever placed it there, she said softly, did so quickly after the lights went out, perhaps. A bold move, but risky. People are far less invisible in darkness than they believe. Slack's jaw tightened. Then we've got our poison source. Question is, who handled it? Her gaze drifted from one face to the next, lingering again on Lucy Barton. That will not be so difficult to learn, Inspector. People who handle such things leave more than fingerprints. They leave conscience. Lucy's voice came out in a tremor. You can't possibly think— But Miss Marple interrupted gently. No one is being accused, my dear. Not yet. But I do think you know more than you've said. Lucy shook her head, her composure breaking. I don't. I swear I don't. I only— She stopped abruptly, biting her lip. Only what? Slack pressed. She hesitated. Only saw her, Mrs. Prowse, arguing with someone before the dance began. Near the cloakroom. It was Mr. Lake. All heads turned. Mr. Lake's face drained of color. That's absurd. We didn't argue. We were discussing a financial matter, that's all. She was threatening to report me to the society board, but I— He stopped short, realizing too late what he'd said. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. So there was indeed a debt to settle. The words hung heavy in the air. Slack's eyes gleamed. Financial, was it? That fits the first note. Mr. Lake raised trembling hands. It wasn't what you think. She accused me of mismanaging funds, of taking a small advance for myself. I meant to repay it. She promised to ruin me. Miss Marple's voice, calm as a whisper, carried to every corner. And perhaps someone else knew of that threat. Someone who feared scandal more than they feared sin. The clock above the stage chimed 1:30. Outside, frost crept higher on the windows, ghostly white against the dark. Miss Marple looked from the broken vial to the trembling schoolmistress, and then to the pale banker. You see, Inspector, she murmured, murder often begins not in hatred but in panic. And panic, once begun, spreads faster than poison itself. Slack looked down at her sharply. You sound as though you know exactly who did it. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her blue eyes twinkling. Oh, I do have an idea, Inspector. But an idea, like a seed, must be watered by truth before it grows into proof. And I believe, before the night is over, someone here will provide that proof, quite without meaning to. Her gaze lingered on the silver flask resting on the inspector's table, as if it might speak when its owner would not. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "Yes, one debt settled, one yet unpaid, and the bill, I think, will come due before morning." The frost had thickened against the hall's windows, blurring the view of the sleeping village beyond. Inside, the air had gone heavy with fatigue and fear. The scent of extinguished candles mingled with that faint, unshakable trace of bitter almonds, which no one dared mention aloud. Inspector Slack paced by the punch table, his boots sounding harsh on the polished boards, while Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes lowered, her knitting untouched beside her. The villagers, slumped in their chairs, whispered in low voices, each afraid of what might come next. Dr. Reeves had taken to pacing near the cloakroom, glancing occasionally at the covered form within. "You can't keep them here all night, Slack," he said finally. "People are frightened, exhausted." Slack didn't look up. "No one leaves till I've got a clear picture of what happened. And I've nearly got it, I think." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Have you, Inspector?" "How splendid." He gave her a wary glance. "You don't agree, I suppose?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that," she replied. "I merely think the picture might be more intricate than it appears. Like tapestry. You must step back to see the pattern." Slack gave a snort. "I prefer something simpler than embroidery, thank you. Poison, a motive, an opportunity. We've got all three. The poison's here." He gestured toward the empty vial. "The motives with Mr. Lake, and the opportunity came when the lights went out." Mr. Lake, who sat hunched and white-faced, flinched. "You make it sound so easy. But I didn't touch her drink, I swear it." "Why would I? She was threatening me, yes, but murder, good Lord, that's madness." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but it carried easily through the murmurs. "It's very often madness that looks most like reason at the time. People convince themselves of necessity when they're cornered." "I wasn't cornered," he protested, but his voice trembled. Mrs. Bantry, who had been silent for some time, leaned toward Miss Marple with an anxious whisper. "Jane, you don't really think that poor young man did it, do you?" Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "I'm not certain of anything yet, my dear. But I do think we've been looking at this rather backwards." Slack paused in his pacing. "Backwards?" "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "We've all assumed the poison was meant for Mrs. Prowse, or, failing that, for Mr. Lake. But what if it wasn't meant for either?" There was a stir among the group. Slack frowned. "Then who?" She smiled faintly. "Ah, that's what we must discover." Before anyone could question her further, the hall door opened with a sudden creak, letting in a gust of cold air and a figure bundled in a heavy coat. It was Constable Jenkins, his breath clouding in the frosty air. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Slack, "but we've checked Mrs. Prowse's cottage as you asked. Found something odd." Slack's eyes narrowed. "Odd how?" The constable produced a small tin, the kind used for lozenges, locked in her desk drawer. "Smells just like that flask." "Cyanide again," Slack muttered, examining it. "So she had her own supply." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Oh, now that is interesting. Mrs. Prowse was a most controlling woman. To think she kept poison about. How very telling." "Could mean suicide," said Slack. "Maybe she took it herself by accident." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I doubt that, Inspector. Mrs. Prowse was the sort of person who preferred other people to make mistakes." Lucy Barton had risen halfway from her chair, her face pale. "If she had the poison herself," she said, "then whoever killed her must have known that. They might have counted on it, to make her death look self-inflicted." "That's a thought," Slack admitted. "So whoever it was, they knew her well enough to know she had cyanide at home." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and well enough to know where she kept it." She turned her calm eyes toward the group. "Now who here visited Mrs. Prowse at home?" There was an uneasy silence. Then Mrs. Chaffee spoke timidly. "Well, I used to stop by with the church circulars now and then." "She'd hardly let anyone in, though." Colonel Archer cleared his throat. "She consulted me about a minor dispute over her boundary hedge last autumn. Mr. Lake gave a hollow laugh. "I visited weekly, when she brought in her building society accounts. But that was hardly social." Miss Marple's gaze settled at last on Lucy Barton. "And you, my dear?" Lucy's lips parted. "Me? No, why should I?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "because you were kind to her when no one else was. You have that sort of nature." And Mrs. Prowse, like many lonely women, mistook kindness for confidence. Lucy faltered. I did go once or twice. She asked me to help sort some papers. She was very, well, exacting." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And you noticed the tin in her desk, perhaps?" Lucy's eyes widened, and for a moment her composure cracked. No, I didn't. At least I don't think," her voice broke. Slack stepped forward. "Miss Barton, if there's something you're holding back, now's the time to speak." Tears sprang suddenly to her eyes. "It wasn't me. I didn't kill her. She made me do things I didn't want to. She knew about Mr. Lake and the money. She said if I didn't tell her everything, she'd ruin him. And she'd ruin me too." Mr. Lake's head jerked up. "Lucy," she turned to him, sobbing, "I was only trying to help you. She said she'd go to the police, that you'd be arrested. I thought if I could get that tin, take it away from her, she'd have nothing to threaten you with." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "So you stole it?" "I meant to return it," she cried. "I didn't know what to do. I never dreamed anyone would die." Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "And did anyone see you take it?" Lucy hesitated. "I don't know. I thought I was alone, but there was someone outside the window. I heard footsteps." Colonel Archer spoke suddenly, voice hard. "That will do. This has gone far enough." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him, serene but unyielding. "Oh, but it's just getting interesting, Colonel. You see, if someone saw Miss Barton take that tin, they might have retrieved it later. They might have realized they could use it to solve two problems at once." Archer's jaw tightened. "You're making wild suppositions, madam." "Am I?" Miss Marple's tone was still gentle, but her eyes were like steel now. "Then perhaps you can explain, Colonel, why there's a scrap of stage curtain in your coat pocket. The same fabric the constable found wrapped round the vial behind the stage." The hall went utterly silent. Archer's face turned a shade paler. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet, her voice calm and steady. "You were the only one who could move freely when the lights went out, Colonel. People make way for authority even in darkness. You had motive, too. Mrs. Prowse was about to expose your dealings with the Memorial Fund, and you knew she kept poison at home. You used her own weapon to silence her, and then quite cleverly made it look as though someone else were to blame." Archer's voice, when it came, was hoarse. "You can't prove that." Miss Marple looked almost kind. "Oh, I think the proof is in your pocket, Colonel. And perhaps a faint trace of almonds still clinging to your hands." Slack stepped forward sharply. "Colonel Archer, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with me." As the inspector spoke, the wind outside rose to a mournful whistle, rattling the panes like fingers on glass. Miss Marple watched in silence as the proud man was led away, her eyes soft with an emotion that was not triumph, but melancholy understanding. When the hall had emptied at last, she turned to Mrs. Bantry, who sat pale and wide-eyed. "You see, my dear," she said gently, "murder is rarely about hatred. It's about fear. Fear of losing one's position, one's pride, one's place in the world. And poor Colonel Archer, I think, feared all three." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "You make it sound almost inevitable." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not inevitable, dear. Only human." The frost pressed closer against the windows, and somewhere far off a church bell struck 2. The new year had begun, as all years do, quietly, indifferently, and with the faint, haunting echo of a dance that had ended in death. The hall, which had been filled with whispers, now echoed with silence. Colonel Archer's arrest had drained the room of its feverish tension, leaving behind a numb quiet that was almost worse. The remaining villagers, pale and subdued, began to gather their coats under Inspector Slack's watchful eye. Outside, The frost glittered silver under the thin moonlight, and the faint sound of a constable's boots crunching over gravel reached through the stillness each time the door opened. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded on her lap, eyes lowered as though in prayer. To anyone watching, she seemed content that justice had been done. But those who knew her well, Mrs. Bantry among them, would have seen the small crease between her brows and known that her mind had not yet come to rest. When the last of the villagers had been escorted out, Slack turned to her with a weary satisfaction. "Well, Miss Marple, looks like you were right. Curtain scrap, poison trace, motive neat as a pin. Archer will hang, sure as sunrise." Miss Marple looked up with a faint smile. "You're very efficient, Inspector. But you'll forgive me if I say I'm not entirely satisfied." Slack frowned. "Not satisfied? Good Lord, woman, what more do you want? The man as good as confessed with his face." "Faces are such unreliable things," Miss Marple murmured. "They're often quite the last part of a person to tell the truth." Slack's brow darkened. "Are you saying he's innocent, then?" "Oh, not at all," she said gently. "I'm saying he might not be guilty of this." He stared at her. "Now what in blazes do you mean?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose and walked toward the cloakroom door, her small figure moving with a deliberate slowness that made the inspector's impatience grow. She paused where the broken bunting still hung, brushing her fingertips lightly across the torn ribbon. "Do you know what troubles me, Inspector?" she asked softly. "The Colonel's nature. He is proud, vain, and domineering, yes. But poison?" She turned to look at Slack. "That is a woman's weapon, Inspector. Always has been. Clean, private, almost domestic in its quietness. A man like Colonel Archer would shoot or strike or bluster, but to creep about in the dark with a bottle of cyanide— No, I don't think that would suit him at all." Slack grunted, clearly uneasy. "But the evidence—" "Evidence," she interrupted kindly, "is a curious thing. It can be laid out as neatly as a supper tray, and still not contain what one's meant to eat." Mrs. Bantry, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, whispered, "Jane, do you mean there's someone else?" Miss Marple's blue eyes lifted, bright and sharp as frost. "Oh, yes, my dear. Someone very clever, who counted on Colonel Archer's pride to do exactly what it did, bury him before he could speak. You see, the good Colonel was a perfect scapegoat. His quarrel with Mrs. Prowse was well known. His temper was reliable, and his arrogance would never allow him to plead or explain. All very convenient for someone who wished to remain invisible." Slack rubbed the back of his neck, his earlier certainty ebbing. "Then who in your estimation would that be?" Miss Marple glanced toward the stage where the music stand still waited, the air faintly scented with wax polish and lilies from the earlier decorations. Someone who could move about unnoticed, someone accustomed to arranging things, to tidying up after others. Before Slack could press her further, there came a sound from the far end of the hall, a soft thud, followed by a low sob. Slack spun around, barking, "Who's there?" It was Lucy Barton. She stood by the cloakroom door, her hand clutching the frame for balance, her eyes wide and tear-streaked. "I couldn't leave," she whispered. "I tried to, but I couldn't." Slack's tone softened, though his suspicion did not. "Miss Barton, you've said enough for one night." But Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the young woman, unblinking. "No, Inspector. I think she's just about to say the one thing we all need to hear." Lucy looked between them helplessly, then buried her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she sobbed. "I only meant to frighten her." "To make her stop," Mrs. Bantry gasped. Slack's notebook hit the floor. "Go on," Miss Marple said quietly. "She ruined everything," Lucy whispered. "Mr. Lake and I, we meant no harm. He only borrowed the money for a short while to cover a debt. I thought I could reason with her, make her see that exposing him would hurt us both. But she laughed at me. She said I was a silly girl and that men like him didn't marry schoolmistresses." Her voice shook. "I found the tin while I was at her house that afternoon. I thought if she couldn't find it, she couldn't threaten anyone. But then she came to the dance and she had another bottle. She said she kept one for emergencies, and she meant to use it metaphorically, of course, but I thought she'd poison him for real out of spite. So I said—" She broke off, trembling. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "So you poured it into the punch instead, hoping to spoil the taste, perhaps? To make her sick, just enough to frighten her?" Lucy nodded miserably. "I never dreamed she'd take Mr. Lake's cup. I thought he would notice, that she'd smell it. I only wanted to stop her from destroying him." There was a long pause. Then Miss Marple sighed. "You see, Inspector, how simple it always is in the end. Poor child! Her motives were almost innocent, but innocence mixed with fear can be a deadly brew." Slack's jaw was set hard. "Then Colonel Archer had nothing to do with it," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Oh, he's guilty of arrogance and vanity, but not murder." Lucy merely panicked afterward, when she realized what she'd done. She saw him near the punch bowl and thought, perhaps she could let suspicion fall there. She left the note, I expect, to strengthen the illusion. Lucy's sobs turned into a low, defeated sound. "I didn't mean to lie. I just couldn't bear everyone knowing." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm, kind but firm. "We seldom mean to lie, my dear. But lies are like snow. They cover what lies beneath until the thaw comes." Slack, who had recovered his composure, straightened. "You understand this means she'll be charged?" Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Yes, Inspector. Though I think a jury will see what really happened. That pride and desperation are poor counselors, and punishment has already found her in the waiting." As Lucy was led away, Miss Marple turned to the window. Dawn had begun to soften the sky beyond the frost, painting the glass with the faintest blush of rose. Mrs. Bantry touched her shoulder. "You were right again, Jane, but it's so dreadfully sad." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze far away. "It always is, in the end. The clever ones are not those who kill. They're the ones who think they can mend the world by doing so. And that," she added softly, "is always the greatest folly of all." Outside, the first bird of morning called, a thin, uncertain note in the cold air. The new year had begun, not with fireworks or laughter, but with quiet truth unveiled at last. And Miss Marple, serene as ever, folded her hands and whispered, "Human nature never changes, thank heaven. Otherwise we'd never be able to understand it at all." The morning light crept slowly into St. Mary Mead, dissolving the last of the night's frost. By the time the church clock struck 8, the village had already begun to hum with the subdued energy that follows scandal. Curtains twitched, kettle whistles pierced the air, and small clusters of neighbours formed with the innocent curiosity of those who are not quite sure if they wish to know more, or if knowing might implicate them in the knowing. Miss Marple, however, was awake long before dawn. She had returned home from the village hall with a weariness that was not physical but moral. The kind that came after the human heart had once again proved itself capable of foolish tragedy. Her fire still glowed faintly in the grate, and the kettle, as always, had been set on for her by her maid, Florence. She sat now at her kitchen table with her cup of tea cooling between her hands, thinking not of guilt or innocence, but of how very predictable people could be, even in the most unpredictable circumstances. A soft knock came at the door, and before she could answer, Florence poked her head in. "Inspector Slack's here, miss," she announced, lowering her voice as though the law itself ought to be spoken of discreetly. "He says it's urgent." "Of course, Florence. Show him in and do see that the poor man gets a hot cup of tea. He's been up all night." Slack entered looking as though he had wrestled with sleep and lost. His coat was dusted with frost, and his expression held the faint embarrassment of a man who has come to see a woman he had thought finished with the matter. "Sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his hands together briskly. "But I thought you'd like to know things aren't quite settled." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I had rather the impression they were." He shook his head grimly. "Lucy Barton's story checks out in parts, but there's something that doesn't fit. We had the lab confirm it. The poison in the punch wasn't from the tin found at Mrs. Prowse's house. Different composition altogether, Same type, but the compound was older, degraded. Someone used a source that had been stored for years. Miss Marple's expression barely changed, though her fingers tapped the side of her cup thoughtfully. Older, you say? That's interesting. Cyanide doesn't last well when exposed to air. It must have been kept very dry, very carefully. Exactly, said Slack, sitting down uninvited. And the Colonel's hands, no trace of the stuff at all. We checked before he was sent to Much Benham for holding. So he's clear, same as you said. But then Lucy's flask doesn't match either. I can't make sense of it. We've got poison from nowhere and a dead woman from somewhere, and the whole business looks tidy when it isn't. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. My dear Inspector, tidiness is the enemy of truth. It's the naturally messy stories that tend to be true. When things fit too well, one ought to be suspicious. He gave her a look halfway between exasperation and respect. Then perhaps you can tell me who actually killed Mrs. Prowse if it wasn't Lucy, and it wasn't Archer. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Oh, I think Lucy did kill her in a manner of speaking. She set the tragedy in motion, but she was not the only hand involved. Slack frowned. You're suggesting 2 people? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that someone saw an opportunity and improved upon it. The inspector's pencil paused above his notebook. Improved upon it? Indeed. Lucy tampered with the punch, yes, but only to frighten. Yet later, when the lights went out, another person poured a small measure of the real thing into Mrs. Prowse's cup. It would explain the degraded compound. The poison came from an older source, something kept hidden away, perhaps from before the war. Slack leaned forward. You've someone in mind, then? Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, someone who had both access and the sort of mind that calculates without conscience. Someone who watched, who waited. But proof, Inspector, proof is the thing. And proof often hides in the little details. He sighed. You've got that tone again. The one that means I'm about to be sent running about the countryside on a wild goose chase. Miss Marple smiled serenely. It's only a short one, I promise. Go to Mrs. Vale's dance studio in Much Benham. Ask her if she keeps cleaning spirits for her floors, the strong kind used to strip polish. I believe you'll find her supply rather depleted. Slack blinked. Mrs. Vale? You can't be serious. Quite, she said. She was very close to Mrs. Prowse once, you know. They both served on the same charity board before Mrs. Prowse accused her of certain indiscretions with the Colonel. The scandal forced Mrs. Vale to resign her position. She smiled her way through it, of course, but I imagine she didn't forgive. And she, unlike Lucy, would know precisely how much poison kills, and how to make sure the wrong woman drank it. He looked skeptical but intrigued. You think she used Lucy's little prank as cover? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Mrs. Vale saw Lucy pour from the flask, noticed the hesitation, perhaps even followed her glance toward the punch. She understood immediately what had been done, and later, when the lights went out, seized the chance to finish what Lucy had begun. A clever woman, Mrs. Vale. Too clever by half. Slack stood, shaking his head. I'll be damned if this turns out to be true. But I'll check. I think you'll find a small vial hidden in her cleaning cupboard, Miss Marple said mildly. The smell will tell you everything you need to know. And perhaps while you're there, do look at her shoes. I noticed last night that one heel was scuffed by something white. Lime dust, I thought. The same kind of dust used to store chemical reagents. Old habits die hard. When the inspector had gone, Miss Marple sat a long while in the quiet kitchen, listening to the clock tick and the fire pop softly. The sun rose higher, gilding the frost on the hedgerows, and with it came the slow hum of the village waking properly to its gossip. She knew by evening everyone would have their own version of the story. Some would call it jealousy, others revenge, a few might say love. But all of them would miss the simplest truth of all. That one small lie, meant only to protect, had opened the door for a greater evil to step through. When Slack returned that afternoon, his face said everything before his words did. You were right, he admitted gruffly. Bottle of industrial cyanide, hidden behind the mop buckets, said it was for cleaning brass fixtures. She nearly fainted when I mentioned the punch bowl. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Poor woman. A lifetime of polish inside and out, and all it took was one dark night to show the tarnish beneath. She'll hang, Slack said grimly. Miss Marple shook her head. Perhaps. But in St. Mary Mead, Inspector, people always hang in conversation long before they hang in court. And Mrs. Vale will find that far worse. As the inspector left, Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains. The village lay quiet beyond, the church steeple glinting in the pale light. She let out a long, weary breath. It is always the same, she murmured softly to herself. One foolish heart, one watchful soul, and one that cannot forgive. And between them death waltzes in. She turned back to her knitting, her needles clicking faintly in the gathering quiet. Outside, the last traces of frost melted from the grass, leaving the earth damp and dark, as if the village itself had wept unseen tears for the final dance of New Year's night. By the time the sun had sunk below the hedgerows, a faint mist had rolled in from the meadows, settling over St. Mary Mead like a weary sigh. The church bells marked 6 o'clock, their soft, familiar notes drifting across the green and mingling with the smoke that rose from cottage chimneys. It should have been an ordinary evening in the quiet village, but there was no ordinary peace to be found. Doors closed faster than usual, conversations dropped at the approach of footsteps, and even the pub, usually so cheerful after dusk, held a hush that was almost reverent. At the far end of the high street, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, the kettle purring gently on the hob. A shawl rested about her shoulders, her knitting laid neatly in her lap, though her hands were still. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, where the embers glowed with that deep, secretive red that seemed to breathe life and death at once. There was a faint rap on the door, brisk but not unkind, and she smiled faintly to herself. "Come in, Inspector," she called. Inspector Slack entered, stamping the damp from his boots. He looked less certain of himself than usual. His cap was in his hands, his expression more thoughtful than triumphant. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, lowering himself into the chair she gestured toward. "You'll be pleased to know Mrs. Vale has made a full confession." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, the faintest nod of acknowledgement. "I thought she might, once the truth began to press on her. Pride gives way under pressure far more quickly than guilt, I've always found." "She held out for a time," Slack said. "Said she only meant to scare Mrs. Prowse, much like Lucy Barton did. But the story unraveled fast. She admitted she'd known about the extra bottle of poison, the one Mrs. Prowse kept hidden away from her housekeeping tin. She said she took it from her old studio storeroom, where she'd kept odds and ends from the war. Cleaning supplies, paint solvents, and cyanide apparently for silver polish." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "I rather thought she'd had some from before her marriage. Her husband dealt in photographic equipment, didn't he?" "Cyanide was often used for fixing prints." Slack gave a short, impressed nod. "You're quite right. We found an old box of it with his initials still on the lid. Must have been sitting there for years. She used a small measure of that in Mrs. Prowse's cup during the blackout, said she hadn't planned to do it until she saw Lucy at the punch bowl. Then she realized the confusion would cover her tracks. How very practical of her," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze distant. "And how very tragic. The clever ones always forget that the heart can't be managed like arithmetic." Slack looked up, frowning. "Funny thing is, she doesn't seem the least bit sorry. She said Mrs. Prowse deserved it. Claimed that woman ruined more lives than she ever helped." "That's true enough," Miss Marple said quietly. "But most of us are ruined by what we choose to believe about others, Inspector. Mrs. Prowse's sin was her certainty. She never imagined she could be wrong. And Mrs. Vale's, of course, was pride." Slack leaned forward. "And Lucy Barton?" "She will live," Miss Marple said, "though it won't be easy. The law will be merciful, I think. She was foolish, but not wicked. She'll carry her remorse as punishment enough. Mr. Lake, on the other hand..." Slack gave a grim chuckle. "Yes, well, he's leaving the county. Handed in his resignation to the Building Society this morning." Can't show his face here anymore, I suppose. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the window, where the mist had deepened into a soft, silvery veil. He'll start over somewhere else. I hope he's learned that secrecy is a poor foundation for trust. But I doubt it. People like him tend to rebuild the same house with the same weak beams. The inspector studied her for a moment. You always talk about people like their flowers or gardens, as if wickedness were just poor soil. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, not wickedness, Inspector. Weakness, that's the difference. Flowers grow toward light because they must. People, too, lean toward whatever comforts them, even when that comfort is dangerous. He grunted thoughtfully, rubbing his chin. You know, Miss Marple, you ought to have been in the force. You'd have made a fine detective. Oh, I think not, she said lightly. I haven't the temperament for authority. One catches more truth by listening than by commanding. Besides, crime has very little to do with criminals, you know. It's all human nature in the end. Slack stood, smiling despite himself. I dare say you're right about that. Well, I'll let you be. You've earned a bit of quiet after this business. Quiet, Miss Marple echoed with a small smile, is rarely what one earns, Inspector. It's merely what one must tend carefully, like a good rosebush. When he had gone, she rose to draw the curtains. The world outside was soft and dim. Only the faint glow from the church tower cut through the fog. Somewhere a clock chimed the half-hour. She stood for a long moment, her hand resting on the windowsill, and in her mind the events of the past 2 nights unfolded again. Every gesture, every voice, every tremor of fear and pride and foolishness that had led to a death that need never have been. How easily it had all happened. Their quarrel here, a secret there, a rash impulse born of jealousy or love or wounded vanity, and before anyone quite realized it, poison had been poured, a life snuffed out, and 3 others broken beyond repair. She sighed, turning back toward the fire, where the last embers glowed faintly gold. It is always the same, she murmured to herself. A small thing, so small at the beginning. A word, a glance, a moment of weakness, and yet by the end a life is gone. People never think it will go so far. Florence appeared at the door with a tray. I brought your supper, miss. You'll be wanting it. Thank you, Florence. Just leave it by the hearth. The girl hesitated, then said in a low voice, I heard them talking down in the village about the murder. Some say it'll put St. Mary Mead on the map at last. Miss Marple gave a soft, rueful laugh. Oh dear, I do hope not. I can't think of anything more unpleasant than notoriety built on tragedy. Best if people forget it quickly. As Florence left, Miss Marple seated herself once more, unfolding her knitting. The steady rhythm of the needles filled the room, gentle and familiar. Outside the fog thickened, muffling the village into stillness. For a long time she worked in silence, her thoughts wandering not to the dead but to the living, to all those left to reckon with what had been done. She thought of Lucy Barton, fragile and repentant, of Mrs. Vale, proud and defeated, of Colonel Archer, whose reputation would forever bear a stain not entirely of his own making, and she thought too of the next time, because there would always be a next time. Human nature ensured that. At last she laid her knitting aside and reached for her tea, now lukewarm but comforting. The clock struck 9, and the sound carried softly through the quiet house. Well, she said aloud to no one in particular, another new year begun. Let us hope this one brings less folly than the last. Then, with the serenity of one who understood that peace was never permanent, but always worth pursuing, Miss Marple folded her hands, watched the fire's final flicker fade to ash, and let the village of St. Mary Mead sink back into its uneasy calm. The new year settled quietly over St. Mary Mead, soft as snowfall. A week had passed since the fateful night at the village hall, and already the gossip had dulled to a tired whisper. People preferred not to speak of Mrs. Prowse any more, at least not openly. It was as if the village itself had decided to tuck away the memory of her death, just as it had hidden so many small scandals before. Miss Marple sat at her parlour window, the morning sun filtering through lace curtains and casting dappled patterns across her knitting. Outside, the milkman passed by with a nod. The postmistress, Mrs. Finch, crossed the lane with her basket, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chaffee, stopped to chat over the gate. Life, as it always did, had resumed its gentle rhythm, and yet beneath the peaceful surface, St. Mary Mead was still rearranging itself around the absence left by one of its most formidable women. There came a knock at the door, firm but polite. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She knew the rhythm of it well. "Do come in, Inspector," she called. Inspector Slack entered, looking both weary and softened by reflection. He removed his hat, nodding respectfully. "Morning, Miss Marple. I thought I'd bring you the latest from Much Benham. Mrs. Vale's trial will be quick, they say. She confessed everything in writing last night." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, folding her knitting. "I rather thought she would." "Silence can only hold so long when the conscience begins to speak," Slack sighed. "Says she's not sorry for Mrs. Prowse's death, only for being found out. Claims she meant to poison her reputation, not her body, but got carried away." He gave a humorless laugh. "If you ask me, that woman's too proud even for remorse." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Pride is a dreadful thing, Inspector. It so often convinces us that we are right, even when our hearts know we are wrong. Poor Mrs. Vale spent so many years perfecting appearances that she forgot truth has a way of staining even the best-kept fabric." Slack nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "And Miss Barton? She's been released, on condition she stays with relatives for a time. They're sending her north to recover. I am glad," Miss Marple said softly. "She will need quiet and kindness. She is not wicked, only young, and youth, when frightened, can be terribly reckless. She'll live with her aunt in Yorkshire," Slack added. "The building society's written to say they'll drop the matter against Mr. Lake. He's already left the county, heading for London. Seems that story's over too." Miss Marple looked out at the garden, where frost still glimmered on the hedges like the last traces of a dream. "Over," she said quietly. "Not entirely, I think. The people involved will carry it with them, whether they know it or not. Guilt leaves its own sort of shadow, Inspector. It clings long after the crime itself is gone." Slack leaned back, his cap in his hands. "You've a strange way of seeing things, Miss Marple. Makes a man feel small sometimes." She gave him a gentle smile. "Not small, Inspector. Simply aware. You see, you deal with crime in terms of law and evidence. I deal with it in terms of people. And people, as you've surely noticed, are never entirely simple." He chuckled softly. "No, they're not. Well, this one's closed at least." "I'll drink to that." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "To closure, then. Though, if you don't mind, I'll drink to understanding instead. It lasts longer." He smiled wryly, raising his cup. "To understanding, then." For a time they sat in companionable silence, the ticking of the mantel clock filling the room. The inspector's eyes followed the little porcelain figures on the mantelpiece, a shepherd and a lady with a lamb, frozen forever in genteel conversation. At last he stood. "Well, I'd best get back. There's always something brewing somewhere. Thank you for your help, Miss Marple. Truth be told, I don't know how we'd manage without you." She laughed softly. "Oh, I dare say you'd manage very well, Inspector. The world has a way of finding its own justice, even if it takes a little longer." After he'd gone, Miss Marple remained by the window, gazing out at the village. Children's laughter floated from the green. The baker's boy rode past on his bicycle, whistling, and the church bell rang for evensong. All the ordinary details of life, weaving themselves back into place, and yet, as she watched, her thoughts turned inward, to Mrs. Prowse, whose sharp tongue and rigid ways had sown resentment where she'd meant order, to Mrs. Vale, who had built her life upon grace and deception, to Lucy Barton, whose fear had kindled a chain of events far beyond her intent. It was a pattern Miss Marple had seen many times, how small vanities, little cruelties, and quiet deceits could tangle into tragedy before anyone quite saw the web they'd spun. She drew her shawl closer and spoke softly to herself, as she often did when the world had proven once more its stubborn sameness. "Murder," she said, "is never born in violence, it is born in silence, in the small places of the heart where truth is inconvenient." Then, as if to punctuate her thought, a faint gust stirred the curtains and sent a few leaves tumbling against the window pane. The fire cracked in the grate, cheerful and domestic. Miss Marple smiled faintly and reached for her knitting again, the needles clicking gently, as though echoing her own patience with the world. By the time dusk settled, the fog had thickened outside, and the lane lay empty, save for the distant glow of a lantern near the vicarage. In that quiet hour, Miss Marple worked on steadily, her thoughts peaceful at last. Another mystery had ended. Another truth had been restored, though, as always, not without cost. When she finally set her knitting aside and rose to draw the curtains, she paused for one last look at the village she knew so well, its windows bright, its roofs pale with frost, its secrets resting for now beneath the calm surface of things. "Good night, St. Mary Mead," she whispered. "Do try to behave yourself just for a little while." Then she turned out the lamp, and the room slipped into darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the dying fire, its last spark fading softly, like the memory of the final dance of New Year's night.